At 38 years old, Darnell Jackson made $69,000 a year as a senior commercial electrician. It was good, honest money earned in the guts of Nashville's gleaming new skyscrapers, running conduit and pulling wire that powered the city's relentless growth. He was proud of his work, of the skill in his hands, and the sweat on his brow. But sitting in the plush, oversized leather chair in the private dining room of Kane Prime Steakhouse in the Gulch, he felt like a fraud. The air, thick with the scent of dry-aged beef and expensive perfume, seemed to choke him. Across the table, his wife Whitney was holding court, her voice a smooth, confident melody that wrapped around her colleagues and family, holding them captive. It was a matter of seeing the opportunity where no one else did, she was saying, gesturing with a hand that wore a $15,000 diamond ring Darnell had financed over 3 years. The quarterly projections were flat, and my director was looking for a miracle. I went back through our latent client portfolios, found a dormant account with massive potential, and pitched a revitalization strategy that secured a 6-figure retainer. It was a huge risk, but it paid off. Her boss, a man named Richard with a shiny scalp and a $3,000 Xenia suit, beamed at her. Paid off is an understatement, Whitney. That move single-handedly made our quarter. You have a killer instinct. Darnell stared into his $22 glass of Cabernet. The dormant account she was talking about wasn't a client. It was the $22,000 bonus he had received for completing the electrical overhaul of the Vanderbilt University Medical Center's new research wing. A brutal 7-month job that had him working nights and weekends. He'd endorsed the check, handed it to her to deposit into their joint savings, and she had spun it into a story of her own corporate genius. It wasn't the first time. His gaze drifted to her sister Brielle, who was sitting next to him, radiating the same smug entitlement. Brielle's boutique clothing store had been a financial black hole for 2 years, yet here she was, wearing a $1,200 Diane von Furstenberg dress, nodding along as if Whitney had just discovered fire. The dinner was in honor of Whitney's promotion to Senior Vice President of Marketing. A promotion, Darnell now understood, built on a foundation of his own grueling labor, 4 years of it. 4 years of massive project completion bonuses he earned for dangerous high-stakes jobs. There was the $12,000 for the emergency generator installation at the downtown data hub, the $18,500 for the Nashville Yards Tower project, and now this. A total of over $70,000 in bonuses, all of which had been absorbed into Whitney's narrative of her meteoric rise. Whitney caught his eye and her smile tightened, a subtle, dismissive curl of her lip. It was a look he knew well. It said, "Just sit there and look presentable. This is my world, not yours." She raised her glass, the crystal catching the low, dramatic lighting. "To my team," she announced, her voice ringing with false modesty, "and to my wonderful, supportive husband, Darnell." The table applauded politely. Supportive, that's what she called him. The silent, invisible partner. The man whose calloused hands funded the very celebration that was erasing him. He felt a cold, hollow space open up in his chest. Then, she turned her gaze directly to him. A cruel glint in her eyes he'd pretended not to see for years. The table was quiet, watching them. "I know I don't say it enough, Darnell," she began, her voice dripping with condescension, "but I appreciate you. You've been a steady presence, a good man to have around while I built my career." Her words hung in the air, each one a small, sharp stone. Her father, a man who measured worth in stock options and country club memberships, cleared his throat. "He's a lucky man, Whitney. You're a rocket ship." Whitney laughed, a sound that was sharp and metallic. She looked back at Darnell, her face unreadable for a moment before it settled into a mask of pure, chilling honesty. "Oh, Daddy, don't be silly." She looked around the table, at her boss, her sister, her parents, all the people who mattered in her world. Then her eyes landed back on Darnell, and she delivered the final devastating blow. "I never loved you," she said, her voice conversational, as if discussing the weather, "and everyone at this table knows it." The silence that followed was absolute. It was heavier than the expensive food, thicker than the perfumed air. Darnell could feel every eye on him, a mixture of pity, embarrassment, and morbid curiosity. He saw the flicker of triumph in Brielle's eyes, the uncomfortable shift of his father-in-law, the cold, clinical assessment from Richard. Whitney just sat there, her expression unchanged, as if she had just commented on the floral centerpiece. She had stripped him bare in front of everyone, not with anger, but with a casual, brutal indifference that was far more destructive. He was not a husband. He was a placeholder, a pity project, a stepping stone she was now finished with. He felt the blood drain from his face, the room tilting slightly. He was a ghost at his own execution. What story will Darnell tell himself to get through this night? So many of us have faced a moment where the story we believed about our lives turned out to be a lie. If you've ever had to find the strength to start over, let us know in the comments how you found your way through. Your story could be the light someone else needs. The house in East Nashville felt different when he walked in that night. It was a modest triplex he and Whitney had bought 5 years ago, before her ambition had metastasized. They lived in the main 2-bedroom unit, renting out the other 2 apartments. It was supposed to be their starter investment, but while Whitney's career had soared, they had somehow never managed to save enough to move. Now he knew why. The money hadn't been saved. It had been spent. On her life, her image, her lie. The worn floorboards, the faint scent of the lemon cleaner he used, the solid weight of the oak front door. It all felt more real, more his, than the sterile glass-walled condo in Green Hills she was always talking about buying. That was her dream, a $430,000 status symbol. This little triplex, with its scuffed baseboards and a garden he tended out back, was his reality. He remembered the day they closed on it. He was 33, making a solid $55,000 a year. Whitney was an account manager then, pulling in about the same. They were a team, or so he thought. "We're building a future, Dee," she'd said, her head on his shoulder as they stood in the empty living room. The afternoon light, golden and warm, streamed through the windows. He had believed her. He had believed in the we. The first big bonus came a year later. A data center in Cool Springs needed a complete electrical refit on an impossible timeline. The company that won the bid was desperate for a senior electrician to lead the crew. Darnell took the job. For 3 months, he worked 14-hour days, sleeping in a cheap motel near the site from Monday to Friday. He'd come home on weekends, exhausted, his body aching, his hands raw. Whitney had been sympathetic, but distant. She was busy with her own big project at work. The job was a success. His company landed a massive long-term contract, and his boss handed him a check for $12,000. It was more money than he'd ever seen in one lump sum. He came home, buzzing with excitement, and laid the check on the kitchen counter. "We did it," he said, pulling Whitney into a hug. "We can finally fix the roof on this place and put the rest toward the Green Hills condo fund." Whitney had looked at the check, her eyes gleaming. "This is amazing, babe." She'd kissed him a quick, dry peck on the cheek. "Let me handle this. I'll deposit it into our high-yield savings account. It'll grow faster there." He'd watched as she took a pen and wrote, "For deposit only," on the back, right below his signature. It was a joint account after all. He trusted her completely. 2 weeks later, at a dinner with her parents, he heard the first version of the story. "I managed to turn a challenging quarter into a major win," she'd announced over dessert. "I identified an under-leveraged asset and secured a new stream of revenue. It's a real feather in my cap." She'd smiled at Darnell. "Darnell's been so supportive while I was burning the midnight oil." He had frowned, confused, but said nothing. He thought he must have misunderstood. The idea that she would so brazenly claim his money as her own work was too absurd, too monstrous to comprehend. He had made a critical mistake in underestimating the depths of her deception. The pattern repeated itself. The next year, it was an $18,500 bonus for retrofitting a historic hotel downtown with a state-of-the-art emergency power system. It was dangerous work, involving asbestos abatement and navigating century-old infrastructure. He came home with burns on his forearms from a minor arc flash. Whitney had sighed, annoyed, when he'd asked her to help him change the dressings. "Darnell, I have a huge presentation tomorrow. Can't you manage?" He'd managed, and when he got the bonus check, he'd again handed it over. This time, the money went toward a down payment on her white BMW 3 Series, a $43,000 car she insisted she needed for her image. "We need to look successful to be successful, Dee," she'd explained. The story she told her friends was that her performance bonus had been so large, she decided to treat herself. He was again the supportive husband cheering from the sidelines. The cruelty escalated in private, in 1,000 small cuts. He'd come home, his work clothes stained with grease and drywall dust, and she'd wrinkle her nose. "Could you please use the back door and shower before you walk on the new $2,400 rug?" His hands, the instruments of his trade, were a source of her disgust. "Can't you do something about those calluses? They're so rough." She'd say it with a little laugh, as if it were a joke, but her eyes were cold. Her sister, Brielle, was her echo. Brielle would visit, sweeping into their modest home like a duchess, her eyes cataloging every perceived flaw. "Whitney, I don't know how you live like this," she'd say, running a finger over a dusty shelf. "It's so quaint." Then she'd look at Darnell. "You're lucky she has you. A man who's good with his hands is so useful." The word hung in the air, useful, like a tool, like a wrench or a screwdriver. Not a partner, not a husband. The public humiliations were worse. At a Christmas party for her marketing firm, held at the opulent Hutton Hotel, Whitney was surrounded by her colleagues. Darnell stood at the edge of the circle, holding a drink, wearing his best $400 suit that felt like a costume. He listened, frozen, as Whitney recounted in vivid detail the challenges of the Vanderbilt Hospital project. She talked about navigating the complex stakeholder demands, the tight deadlines, the unexpected structural issues. She used the exact phrases Darnell had used when he'd vented to her over the phone late at night from the job site. "It was a logistical nightmare," she said, shaking her head with theatrical exhaustion. "But my team and I pulled it off. We launched the campaign on time, and the client was ecstatic." Her boss, Richard, had put an arm around her. "That's our Whitney, always turning lead into gold." Darnell felt invisible, his own life, his own sweat and risk, being narrated by his wife as a chapter in her grand success story. He had looked at her, hoping to catch her eye, to see some flicker of acknowledgement, of shared history. Instead, she glanced past him, her focus entirely on Richard. In that moment, he wasn't her husband. He was just a man in the background of her victory photo. The outrage began to accumulate in his chest, a slow, burning pressure. He told himself he was being sensitive. He told himself he was misinterpreting things. He loved her, and love required trust, didn't it? He had no idea how wrong he was. The final betrayal was the promotion. The dinner at Kane Prime was the culmination of it all. The $22,000 bonus from the Vanderbilt job, which she had framed as a client retainer, was the cornerstone of the portfolio she presented to the board. It was the killer instinct Richard had praised. It was a complete fabrication, a lie so audacious that it had become her truth. And as she sat there after gutting him with her words, she looked utterly, placidly content. But something had happened at that dinner. A small, strange detail he'd almost missed in the shock of it all. After her devastating pronouncement, the waiter had returned to the table. He had leaned down and spoken quietly to Brielle. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but your card was declined." Brielle had flushed a deep, ugly red. "That's impossible. Run it again." Whitney had waved a dismissive hand. "Don't worry about it, sweetie. Technical glitch." She'd looked at Darnell. "Darnell will get it." It wasn't a question. It was a command. He had taken out his own credit card, his simple, no-frills Visa, from his local credit union, and paid the $1,874.50 bill. As he signed the slip, his phone, which he'd set to silent, buzzed on the table. A single, persistent vibration. In the haze of his humiliation, he hadn't looked. He just wanted to get out of there. Now, standing in the quiet of his own home, the memory of that buzz returned. He pulled his phone from his pocket. It was a 2021 Google Pixel 6, a practical $600 phone, not the latest $1,200 iPhone Whitney and Brielle flaunted. There was one unread email. The sender was a name he didn't recognize. Marcus Thorne. The subject line made the breath catch in his throat. Urgent inquiry. Joint account activity. Account number. XXXX. His heart started to pound, a heavy, frantic rhythm against his ribs. He opened the email. It was from the Fraud and Risk Investigation Unit at SunTrust Bank. "Mr. Darnell Jackson, my name is Marcus Thorne, and I am a lead investigator with SunTrust's Internal Fraud Division. We are conducting a review of unusual activity on the joint checking and savings accounts held in your and Ms. Whitney Jackson's names. Specifically, we have flagged a series of large, regular cash transfers from your savings account to a third-party account belonging to a Ms. Brielle Shaw. These transfers, totaling over $78,000 in the past 24 months, are inconsistent with your account's history. Additionally, several large deposits into the savings account, categorized by the secondary account holder as client retainer payments, correspond directly with payroll bonus disbursements from your employer, Jackson Electrical Contractors. We have reason to believe these funds may have been deliberately miscategorized. Your phone number was flagged for contact after miss. Shaw's debit card, linked to the receiving account, was declined this evening at 8:17 p.m. due to insufficient funds, triggering a risk alert. Please contact me at your earliest convenience to discuss this sensitive matter." Darnell sank onto his worn, comfortable $800 sofa. He read the email again and again. The pieces clicked into place with a sickening finality. The declined card, the client retainer payments, the transfers to Brielle. It wasn't just that Whitney had stolen his stories. She had stolen his money, all of it. She had used their joint account as her personal slush fund to bail out her failing sister, all while building a career on a throne of lies. The humiliation from the dinner table curdled into something else. Something cold, hard, and sharp. It was the feeling of a switch being flipped in a dark, silent room, illuminating everything in a harsh, unforgiving light. The woman he thought he loved didn't exist. She never had. He was married to a stranger, a con artist, and she had made a critical mistake. She thought he was a simple man. She thought he was weak. She had no idea what was coming. The next morning, Darnell woke up at 5 a.m., his internal clock wired for the early start of a job site. For a moment, everything was normal. The quiet hum of the refrigerator, the first pale light of dawn filtering through the blinds. Then the weight of the previous night crashed down on him. The email, the dinner. Whitney's voice saying, "I never loved you." He felt the familiar pang of hurt, but it was distant now, muffled by a new, chilling clarity. He was no longer a victim. He was a man with a purpose. He got out of bed, moving silently. Whitney was still asleep, a serene smile on her face, lost in dreams of her own success. He looked at her, this woman who had shared his bed for 7 years, and felt nothing. The love had been hollowed out, leaving only a vast, cold emptiness. He went into the kitchen and made coffee, his movements precise and deliberate. He wasn't just making coffee, he was starting his new life. He sat at the small kitchen table with his $89 Timex watch next to a steaming mug and his phone. He reread Marcus Thorne's email, transfers totaling over $78,000, his bonuses, his sweat, his risk, his aching muscles, all siphoned away to fund Brielle's vanity project, her failing boutique. Whitney hadn't just erased his contribution, she had actively stolen from him to prop up her sister. He had to play this perfectly. He couldn't let her know that he knew. Not yet. The element of surprise was his only real weapon. He needed more than just the bank's email. He needed his own proof, his own story to tell. When Whitney finally emerged from the bedroom at 7:30 a.m., wrapped in a $300 silk robe, she looked refreshed and entirely unbothered. She saw him at the table and offered a small, tight smile. "Morning," she said, her tone breezy, as if she hadn't detonated their entire marriage just hours before. Darnell looked up from his phone, schooling his features into a mask of weary resignation. "Morning. Look, about last night," she began, pouring herself a glass of water. "I know that was a lot, but it needed to be said. We can be adults about this, right? I'll have my lawyer draw up the papers. It will be very straightforward." He just nodded, pretending to be beaten down. "Okay, Whitney." "Good." She seemed pleased by his lack of fight. She thought he was broken. Perfect. "I have a busy day. Big meeting with the board about the new strategic direction." She paused, then added, "Don't worry, I'll be fair in the settlement. You can even stay here in the triplex for a few months while you figure things out." The condescension was breathtaking. She was offering him his own home as a temporary kennel. He just sipped his coffee. "Thanks. That's generous of you." She smiled, a genuine, satisfied smile this time. The pity husband was playing his part beautifully. She had made a critical mistake. The moment she left, a whirlwind of expensive perfume and ambition, Darnell went to work. He called the number in the email. Marcus Thorne. The voice was calm, professional. "Mr. Thorne, this is Darnell Jackson. You emailed me last night." "Mr. Jackson, thank you for calling me back so promptly. I understand this must be difficult. Do you have time to talk?" "I have all the time in the world," Darnell said. For the next hour, Marcus Thorne walked him through the bank's findings. The investigation had actually started 2 weeks prior, triggered by Brielle attempting to secure a business loan using her account statements as proof of income. The loan officer had noted the large, regular inflows from a personal savings account and flagged it as unusual. That had started the internal review. The deposits from Jackson Electrical, clearly marked as payroll, being recategorized as client retainers in Whitney's own notes on the banking app, was the smoking gun. It suggested intent to deceive. "Your wife has been using your bonus income to create a false paper trail of her own success while simultaneously funding her sister's business," Thorne explained. "From the bank's perspective, this has elements of wire fraud and deliberate misrepresentation of assets. Because it's a joint account, it's messy, but your cooperation is key." "What do you need from me?" Darnell asked, his voice steady. "We need you to corroborate that you were not aware of these transfers or the recategorization of your bonus deposits. And we need any documentation you might have. Pay stubs, employment letters, anything that ties those specific deposit amounts to your name and your work." "I have all of it," Darnell said. He had kept every pay stub, every letter from his boss, congratulating him on a job well done. He was meticulous that way. "I'm looking at a folder of them right now." After the call, he booked an appointment with a lawyer. He didn't go for the flashy downtown firms Whitney would have chosen. He found a woman named Aaliyah Vance online. She was a former prosecutor who had started her own family law practice in a modest office building in Midtown. Her reviews were stellar, describing her as a shark in a cardigan. Her rate was $650 per hour. He booked a consultation for that afternoon and paid the fee with his own credit card. He spent the rest of the morning feigning normalcy. He did a load of laundry. He cleaned the kitchen. He acted like the defeated husband Whitney expected him to be. At 1 p.m., he got in his 2012 Toyota Camry with 187,000 miles on it and drove to Aaliyah Vance's office. Aaliyah was a sharp, intelligent black woman in her 40s, with her natural hair styled in elegant twists and a gaze that missed nothing. She listened intently as Darnell laid out the entire story, from the first bonus to the humiliating dinner to the email from the bank. He pushed a folder across her desk. In it were copies of his pay stubs, the letters from his boss, and a printout of Marcus Thorne's email. She read through everything in silence, her expression unreadable. When she finished, she looked up at him. "Mr. Jackson," she said, her voice calm and measured, "your wife isn't just an adulterer of the heart, she's a thief, and she's incredibly sloppy." She leaned forward. "Here is what we are going to do. First, you are going to open a new bank account at a different institution. Today, you will have your employer redirect your direct deposit to that account immediately. Second, you will continue to act as if you know nothing. You are heartbroken, you are lost, you are compliant. We need her to feel secure and in control. Third, I will coordinate with Mr. Thorne at the bank. The fraud investigation will proceed. When they have completed their report, they will freeze the joint accounts. At that exact moment, I will have a process server deliver divorce papers to your wife at her office." Darnell felt a surge of adrenaline. This was a plan. This was action. "What about the triplex?" "This house?" Aaliyah asked, tapping the address on his client intake form. "You bought it together, before the bonuses started rolling in, correct? With funds from both your salaries?" "Yes." "Then it's marital property. But the money she stole from you, plus the money she funneled to her sister, we can argue that should be deducted from her share of the equity. We will fight to make you whole. We will argue that her actions constitute financial dissipation of marital assets, and we will win." She gave him a thin, confident smile. "She thinks she's a master strategist, Mr. Jackson. We're going to show her what a real strategy looks like." He left her office feeling 10 feet tall. The fog of shame and hurt had burned away, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. He drove straight to a branch of his credit union and opened a new account. He called his company's HR department and changed his direct deposit. The first steps were taken. That evening, he had to play the part again. Whitney came home, flushed with success from her big meeting. She barely glanced at him as she dropped her $6,000 Bottega Veneta handbag on the counter. "I need you to do me a favor," she said, pulling a bottle of San Pellegrino from the fridge. "My parents are having a small get-together on Saturday to celebrate my promotion. I need you to be there. We need to present a united front for a little while longer, for appearances." A united front? He almost laughed. She wanted to use him as a prop one last time. "Sure, Whitney, whatever you need." "Good," she said, not even looking at him. "And try to wear something decent. Not that old suit. For the next 3 days, he lived a double life. By day, he was on the phone with Aaliyah and Marcus, providing documents, signing affidavits, and building the case. He went to work, pulling wire at a new construction site on Music Row, the familiar grounding work a balm to his frayed nerves. At night, he was the sad, pathetic husband, watching TV on the couch while Whitney tapped away on her laptop, probably drafting press releases about her own brilliance. The tension was almost unbearable. He felt like one of the high-voltage cables he worked with every day, humming with a dangerous, controlled power, waiting for the moment to connect. They had no idea what was coming. Saturday arrived, cloaked in a brilliant, cloudless Nashville sky. The kind of day that felt full of promise. For Darnell, it felt like the calm before a perfectly engineered storm. The gathering was at Whitney's parents' house in Green Hills, a sprawling 5,000-square-foot brick colonial that screamed old money. The driveway was filled with luxury cars, Mercedes, BMWs, a solitary Porsche. Darnell parked his humble Toyota Camry at the end of the street, as if to keep it from being contaminated by the sheer wealth. He walked up the stone pathway, his heart a steady, rhythmic drum. He was wearing a new suit, a sharp, charcoal gray Hugo Boss number that had cost him $950, a purchase Aaliyah had insisted on. "You are not going to look like a victim," she'd said. "You are going to look like the man who owns the room." He entered the house and was immediately enveloped in a wave of forced cheerfulness and expensive cologne. Whitney's father, Robert, clapped him on the shoulder, a gesture that felt more like a shove. "Darnell, good of you to come. Whitney's out on the patio." Darnell nodded and made his way through the immaculate home. On the patio, Whitney was the center of a glittering universe. She was wearing a vibrant blue dress that cost more than his monthly mortgage payment, laughing as her colleagues and family hung on her every word. She saw him, and her smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she recovered. "Everyone, you know my husband Darnell," she said, her tone implying he was a distant, slightly embarrassing relative. He nodded politely to the group, accepting their lukewarm greetings. Brielle was there, hovering at Whitney's side, her eyes narrowed in suspicion as she took in his new suit. She sensed something was off, but couldn't put her finger on it. For the next hour, Darnell played his role to perfection. He was quiet, reserved, the dutiful husband standing in the shadow of his brilliant wife. He nursed a single club soda, watching the charade unfold. He listened to Whitney tell the story of the Vanderbilt project again, this time with even more embellishments. He watched her mother, a woman who communicated exclusively through passive aggression, praise Whitney for being the family's shining star. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawn and its pristine, unused garden. The sky bled into hues of orange and purple. Robert tapped a crystal glass with a spoon, calling for everyone's attention. "I'd just like to propose a toast," he said, beaming with pride. "To my daughter, Whitney. From the day she was born, we knew she was destined for great things. She has worked so hard with integrity and grit to get where she is today, Senior Vice President. It's a testament to her character. To Whitney." "To Whitney," the crowd echoed. As they drank, Whitney caught Darnell's eye over the rim of her champagne flute. She gave him a tiny, triumphant smirk. This was her victory, and he was nothing more than a footnote. This was the moment. Aaliyah's instructions were clear. Wait for the peak of her hubris. Darnell set his glass down on a nearby table. The small clink of glass on stone seemed to cut through the chatter. He took a half step forward. "Excuse me," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it was clear and steady, and it carried an unexpected weight. The conversations on the patio sputtered and died. Everyone turned to look at him. Whitney's smile froze on her face. Darnell? What is it? He looked directly at her father. Robert, you said Whitney achieved this with integrity. I'm afraid that's not entirely true. A collective gasp went through the small crowd. Robert's face darkened. What is the meaning of this, Darnell? The meaning, Darnell said, his gaze sweeping over the stunned faces before landing on Whitney, is that this entire promotion, this entire celebration, is based on a lie. Whitney's face went white. Darnell, stop it. You're embarrassing yourself. Am I? Darnell reached into the inner pocket of his new suit jacket. He pulled out a slim file folder. Let's talk about that killer instinct you have, Whitney. Let's talk about the dormant client account you revitalized. The one that secured a six-figure retainer. He opened the folder. Funny, because I have a pay stub here from my employer, Jackson Electrical, for a project completion bonus. The project was the Vanderbilt Medical Center overhaul. The date is October 17th. The amount is for $22,350 before taxes. He held up the paper. And I have a bank statement here from our joint savings account showing a deposit for that exact same amount 2 days later, which you personally categorized in the banking app as a client retainer payment VMC account. The silence was deafening. He could see Richard, her boss, looking from the paper to Whitney, his expression shifting from confusion to dawning horror. That's not all, Darnell continued, his voice devoid of emotion. He was simply stating facts. He pulled out another sheet. There was also the $18,500 bonus from the Nashville Yards Tower project. You told your friends that was your performance bonus that paid for your BMW. But it was my performance, wasn't it, Whitney? And the $12,000 bonus for the data hub job? The one you used as a story at your parents' dinner table 2 years ago? He repeated her own words back to her. You said, I identified an under-leveraged asset and secured a new stream of revenue. The asset was my paycheck. Whitney was trembling, her mouth opening and closing with no sound coming out. Brielle rushed to her side. He's lying. He's a bitter, jealous man who can't stand to see her succeed. Darnell turned his cold gaze on Brielle. And you? Let's talk about you, Brielle. He pulled another document from the folder. It was a summary of the bank's internal investigation, which Aaliyah had been forwarded that morning. For the past 2 years, Whitney has been transferring money from our savings account to you. My money. A total of $78,400. You used it to fund your failing boutique and to try and fraudulently secure a business loan. SunTrust Bank's fraud division has been investigating you for 2 weeks. Brielle looked like she had been struck. Her face crumpled. At that exact moment, Darnell's phone vibrated in his pocket. It was a text from Aaliyah. A single, powerful word. Done. He looked up at Whitney, whose face was a mask of disbelief and terror. Her entire world was collapsing in real time, in front of everyone who mattered to her. Her boss, her parents, her friends. She finally found her voice, a strangled whisper. You can't prove any of this. Darnell held up his phone, showing her the screen with Aaliyah's text. Then he looked her dead in the eye, and with quiet, devastating finality, he said the 2 words that would end her life as she knew it. Account frozen. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the gentle whisper of the evening breeze and the distant Nashville traffic. Whitney stared at him, her eyes wide with the full, catastrophic understanding of what he had done. He hadn't just exposed her lies. He had coordinated with the bank. He had hired a lawyer. He had planned this with cold, methodical precision. He had taken everything she had built her life on and in the space of 5 minutes, turned it to ash. The pity husband was gone. In his place stood a man who had finally claimed his own story. He turned without another word and walked away from the wreckage, the setting sun at his back. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic, a cascade of consequences that dismantled Whitney's carefully constructed world, piece by piece. The silence on that patio was just the opening act. First came the professional implosion. Richard, her boss, had pulled her aside before Darnell's car had even reached the end of the street. The conversation was brief and brutal. On Monday morning, Whitney was called into a meeting with HR and the company's legal counsel. The evidence was irrefutable. Darnell, through Aaliyah, had already forwarded the bank investigator's summary and copies of his pay stubs to the company's general counsel. Whitney had built her promotion portfolio on fraudulent claims. She had misrepresented company assets by framing his bonuses as her own business development wins. It was an ethical and legal minefield. She was fired on the spot, her termination effective immediately. She was escorted from the building by security, carrying her personal effects in a cardboard box, a humiliating walk of shame past the colleagues who had toasted her just 2 days earlier. The company, fearing a lawsuit from Darnell and damage to their reputation, issued a quiet internal memo retracting her promotion and citing gross ethical misconduct. Her career in marketing, built on a lie, was over. She was blacklisted. Next was the financial ruin. The frozen joint accounts were just the beginning. Aaliyah Vance was, as her reviews promised, a shark. She filed for divorce, citing financial fraud and dissipation of marital assets. The $78,400 Whitney had funneled to Brielle became the centerpiece of the legal battle. Aaliyah argued successfully that this was not just shared money being spent. It was Darnell's specific, non-salaried income being stolen and given away without his knowledge or consent. The judge agreed. In the divorce settlement, Darnell was awarded the full amount of his stolen bonuses, plus legal fees. Whitney's share of the equity in the East Nashville triplex was liquidated to pay him back. What little was left was devoured by her own legal bills. The $430,000 Green Hills condo she dreamed of was now an impossible fantasy. Within 6 months, she was forced to sell her white BMW 3 Series to cover her mounting debts and move into a cramped one-bedroom apartment in a rundown complex in Antioch, a world away from the glamour of Green Hills. Then there was Brielle. The bank's fraud investigation moved forward with criminal intent. Faced with federal charges for bank fraud related to her loan application, Brielle took a plea deal. She had to liquidate her boutique's entire inventory and assets to pay back the $78,400 to the bank. The store she had treated as her personal kingdom, the source of her smug superiority, was shuttered, a for lease sign plastered on its window. She avoided jail time but was left with a criminal record, a mountain of debt, and the public shame of her failure. The social fallout was just as devastating. Their parents, Robert and his wife, were mortified. Their daughter, their shining star, was a fraud and a thief. Their other daughter was a criminal. Their carefully curated reputation in the Green Hills community was shattered. Friends stopped calling. Invitations to the country club dried up. They were consumed by the scandal. Their names whispered about at dinner parties and charity events. Robert tried to call Darnell once, a week after the patio incident. "Son, I had no idea. We are so sorry." Darnell listened and then said simply, "I'm not your son, Robert." He hung up the phone. Whitney's frantic voicemails started the day after she was fired. They were a study in psychological collapse. The first was angry and defiant. "You think you can ruin me, Darnell? You have no idea who you're dealing with." The second was pleading. Okay, you made your point. I'm sorry. Please, just call off the lawyers. We can work this out." The third was a tearful, desperate mess. They took my key card. They walked me out like a criminal. My life is over. You did this to me. Please, please help me. He listened to each one, his face impassive, and then deleted it. Her words had no power over him anymore. They were just noise. For Darnell, the silence that followed the storm was peace. He stayed in the triplex, the house that was now entirely his. The deed was in his name alone. The silence wasn't empty, it was full. It was full of potential, of a future he could build with his own two hands, on his own terms. The ghosts of Whitney and her cruelty faded with each passing day, replaced by the simple, satisfying reality of his own life. 1 year later, the late afternoon sun streamed through the large window of Darnell's living room in East Nashville, illuminating the floating dust motes in a golden haze. The room was different now. The pretentious, uncomfortable furniture Whitney had insisted on was gone, replaced by a sturdy, comfortable sofa and armchairs he'd bought from a local craftsman. The walls were adorned not with abstract art he never understood, but with framed architectural blueprints of his most challenging projects, a quiet testament to his real work, his real value. The air smelled of sawdust and lemon oil, a scent of creation and cleanliness. Darnell had bought the triplex outright with the settlement money. The house was his, free and clear. It was more than a home. It was a foundation. He sat at his solid oak dining table, a set of electrical plans spread out before him. But he wasn't looking at the plans. He was looking out the window, at the community garden he had helped organize in the small, neglected park across the street. It was flourishing, a patch of vibrant green in the urban landscape, tended by families from the neighborhood. A knock came at his open door. 2 young men stood there, both in their early 20s, their work boots dusty and their faces bright with a mixture of fatigue and eagerness. They were Marcus and Jamal, the first 2 apprentices in the mentorship program Darnell had started. "Hey, Darnell," Marcus said, holding up a small, intricate piece of bent conduit. "We finished the practice bends. Wanted you to check 'em before we call it a day." Darnell smiled, a genuine, easy smile that reached his eyes. He had rented the other 2 units of his triplex to his apprentices at a heavily subsidized rate. He wasn't just their boss or their landlord, he was their teacher. He was passing on the skills that had saved him, the trade that had given him a sense of worth when everything else had been stripped away. He took the piece of conduit, his calloused fingers expertly tracing the smooth, perfect 90-degree angles. "This is good work, Jamal," he said. "Clean, precise. You're getting the feel for it." Jamal, who was usually shy, beamed with pride. "Thanks, Darnell. You're a good teacher." "It's because I had good teachers," Darnell replied, his voice warm. He looked at these 2 young black men, so full of potential, and saw a reflection of his own journey. He was giving them the one thing no one had ever given him, a guide who saw their value and wanted to see them succeed on their own terms. After they left, Darnell cleaned up his plans and went to the kitchen to start dinner. His phone buzzed on the counter. It was a number he didn't recognize. He almost ignored it, but something made him answer. "Hello?" A hesitant, broken voice on the other end. "Darnell?" It was Whitney. He hadn't heard her voice in almost a year. It was thin, fragile, stripped of all its former confidence and arrogance. I know you have no reason to talk to me," she stammered. I saw an article online about the community garden you started. It said you were teaching kids from the neighborhood about urban farming." Darnell said nothing. "I'm working at a coffee shop now," she said, her voice cracking. "In Murfreesboro, I'm in therapy. I'm trying to understand why I did what I did. I was so empty, Darnell. I thought if I had all the things, the job, the money, the image, I would feel whole. but it was all just hollow. She took a shaky breath. I'm sorry for everything. I know it's too late. I know it doesn't change anything, but I needed to say it. You were a good man. You were a good husband, and I destroyed that. Darnell listened, and for the first time he didn't feel anger or coldness. He felt a quiet, distant pity. He had already moved on. Her apology wasn't for him. It was for her. It was a step on her own path, a path that no longer intersected with his. I hope you find some peace, Whitney, he said, and his voice was gentle. It was the gentle voice of a man who was already at peace himself. He ended the call before she could reply. He stood in his kitchen, the evening light painting the room in soft colors. He thought about the life he was building. It wasn't flashy. It wouldn't be celebrated in private steakhouse dining rooms or written up in business journals. It was a quiet life, built on the foundations of hard work, integrity, and community. It was a life of service, of teaching, of planting seeds, both in the garden and in the minds of his apprentices. He realized that true wealth isn't measured in bonuses or job titles. It's not about the car you drive or the suit you wear. True wealth is what you build with your own two hands, the skills you master, and the legacy you pass on to others. It's the solid ground beneath your feet and the quiet satisfaction of a day's work well done. Whitney had tried to steal his money, but she could never steal his worth, because his worth was in his hands, in his heart, and in the simple, powerful truth of who he was. And that was a fortune no one could ever take away. We all face betrayals that force us to rediscover our own value. The journey from pain to purpose is a powerful one, and it often leads us to a more authentic and meaningful life. Have you ever turned a devastating loss into a chance to build something new and better? Share your story of rebuilding in the comments below. Let's inspire each other to find the wealth that truly matters.